Hi, from the Reamer's home. I've invited Pastor Chris and Pastor Brian here to join me. For several days now, we've had in mind to do a joint recording in which we can just chat with you about our thoughts about our current situation and our future situation, as well, as much as we might be able to anticipate that. We want you to know that we also feel very much the frustration of not being able to meet together. That we are able to go to our building every Sunday morning, but we have to tell you, it's not very satisfying to be there and to have that building empty. We are eagerly looking forward to life getting back to normal, and we really regret the uncertainties that we're having to face. We know that life in your home and where you work and how you shop, all these things are in upheaval. This is a really strange time for our country and really throughout the world, as you know. And we're grappling with that in our own circumstances as well. And we just really appreciate your patience, your submission to the Lord in all of this, maturity that our people have displayed, that we continue to hear about, the outreaches to people in need. The stories come in, the opportunities aren't as abundant as we might like, but the stories keep coming in, and we're just really gratified that in a time of trial, that God's grace is sufficient and God's people are utilizing that grace and accomplishing His purpose through all of this. This isn't part of what our plan was for this time of year, but we all know it was part of God's plan. And we're grateful to be part of God's plan, no matter what that involves. As God's Word instructs us to take up our cross every day. Well, every day for the last number of weeks, it's meant God telling us, no, it's another day where you've got to stay away from most other people, and all kinds of restrictions that we don't like, and we're hopeful that they're not going to last very long at all. We all want this to be over, and just want to assure you that our eagerness about this is great and growing to get done with this. And I urge you to join us in praying every day that God would redirect our governor, that he would sense the opportunity is right for us. And we understand a lot of pressure on him, but he needs to take his directions from God, and God is certainly capable of telling him when the time is right for us.
And I think even as we reach out to our church family and have different phone calls, we recognize that everyone is experiencing this quarantine in a different way, depending upon your stage of life, depending upon where you live and your job. We're all experiencing this very differently. I mean, even within our pastoral staff, we're all at different stages. Chris's kids are a little bit younger than mine. Mine are a little bit older. Pastor's kids are
a little older than that.
Yes. It may be tough to deal with them, but it's different for all of us. And it's healthy for us to keep that in mind as we think about you as our church family, understanding that fact, and we are striving to do that as best we can.
This is easy for no one, and we acknowledge that. It takes different forms for different people, but no one is sitting around bored. We understand that. And even if there is a lack of energetic opportunities, that in itself is a challenge as well, because so many of us are eager to be active. We are eager to get out and to do things and to do things with people we love. And so all of those different forms are challenging, and yet they are God-ordained at this time. And it is our earnest prayer that that's not God-ordained for much longer, according to His will. That's our desire.
I, for one, am getting really tired of having to give myself a haircut. It I'm just happy I've been able to avoid disaster so far, but it's a little funny over here.
Well, there are options that are easier, that I could share with you.
I haven't
all
tried
right.
either, and I don't plan to.
All
I'll just
right.
hold out until the barbershop opens up again.
All right.
Well, we are thankful for this opportunity, and one of the things that we want to do through this video and communicating to you is to help you understand what we've been doing as a pastoral staff as we have tried to navigate our church through these waters. This is new for the three of us. This is something that has not happened, obviously, anytime recently. So we want to communicate what are kind of the guidelines we've been, not guidelines, but the things that we've been trying to evaluate, as we evaluated things, how we've been doing that. And I think there's 4 things that we've been trying to think through as we've come to each decision at this time. The first thing that we want you to understand is that we take our responsibility that God has given us to shepherd you very seriously. Acts 21, verse 28, Paul is speaking to the Ephesian elders, and he says this: "Pay careful attention to yourselves and to all the flock in which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to care for the church of God, which he has obtained with his own blood." It's a sober responsibility that we have to care for you. So the decisions that we make, it's always in the back of our mind, first and foremost, I guess, what does God have? What has he revealed to us in his word that we can use to guide us in our decision-making process? And then we are trying also to take our entire church family into account. And as I stated earlier, we're all at different stages of life, which means that this is affecting us differently. And even it would affect us as we even try to gather back together. So trying to evaluate, not just think about one group of people or section of our church, but to try and think of the church as a whole. Second thing that we have been using to try to evaluate what we ought to do is God's admonition to us to submit to our government. Romans 13 makes it clear that God has ordained government for our good. And he has ordained that so that government can help to preserve life and to keep things orderly. And yet in that, we have an admonition there to submit to it as it is from God. And as we think about this whole pandemic and what the government regulations have caused us to do, we've been reminded that as we submit to them, that they're not targeting us as churches. The regulations that they've set up have been for everyone, from movie theaters to stores to restaurants to sporting events, and the church is just a part of that. And so as we make decisions, we're trying to be as submissive as we can in a reasonable way. Then another thing that we're considering is God's command to love our neighbor and to love one another. And it's difficult for us in this stage to fully understand the seriousness of this virus. But what we're wanting to do is to be cautious and to think about those within our church, those within our community, and try to make our decisions based upon what is going to be best in regards to the health of our community and our church family.
Something in addition to that as well that we all can acknowledge is that our church family has a broad spectrum of ages and also a broad spectrum of perspectives on this situation. Mm-hmm. And we need to admit that and acknowledge that. And that is actually an evidence of the great diversity that God has given us in a church family. That's not a bad thing, that those perspectives are so diverse. We have a section of the church potentially that is very concerned about this and considers it a major issue. There's a perspective that some may share that they're kind of indifferent to it, not really sure what to think or not overly concerned. And then there's the perspective that this is dramatically overblown, perhaps as well. And so, despite those different perspectives, it is still a church family. And we have the opportunity and the responsibility to, despite how much we crave something, and we all do, to acknowledge those different perspectives in love. And that's something that we have been trying to do, is to find that balance between those three perspectives in how we approach services, opportunities, fellowship opportunities, and so forth.
Absolutely. And even, we think about our own church family, and then we think of our the community in which we live. And this is another thing that we take into consideration, is how our decisions would affect the community. And so for the sake of the gospel, we want to do everything we can to, in a reasonable way, to model that submission to the government. And there's perspectives out there all up and down the viewpoints, and yet we want to do whatever we can so that we don't hinder a gospel opportunity through what we might do as a church. So all that to say, we really, as a pastoral staff, feel the weight and the sobriety of our position. And to be honest with you, it's difficult to be in, but we are doing what we can based on what God's word teaches us to make the best decision for our church family.
And we know you're praying for us as well. I can't tell you how much we appreciate that. That's a regular feature of one of the benefits of being a pastor at Cornerstone, is that we know our people are supporting us in prayer. And all the more so when circumstances are so strange and challenging. And I really appreciate, I know many people have expressed it, and I know many, many others are doing the praying as well. And just urge you to please keep that up, because we need God's continuing grace every day.
And that prayer is mutual, by the way.
That's right.
Extensive. We pray for you. We really do.
We thought it might be helpful just to do a brief review of some of these government acts, statements. Executive orders. Those are the ones that really affect us. I mean, there have been two things going on here. One is the President's task force that has met daily for weeks and have issued guidelines and made adjustments to that and so forth. And they're the ones that first set up the social distancing and made it effective for, I think it was 30 days, for about a month. Well, that's come to an end. They still have their recommendations in place, and they have now passed it off to each of the governors to determine how their states will gradually reopen. So we're very thankful to be in South Carolina, where we have a very sympathetic governor, where we really have no reason to question that he wants the best for all the people in our state, and that includes God's people. He has been very cautious in what he has done. But he issued his first executive order, I think it was all the way back to about March 15th or so. That was a Sunday afternoon. We had already scheduled a deacons meeting that same afternoon, and his announcement came while we were meeting. We were anticipating it. Came out a little bit different than we were expecting, and we had to adjust our plans at that point. But what he said at that point, he didn't qualify with any exceptions. He didn't even ever mention church in that one. And so we had to take it, and I think appropriately, still looking back, it was really what he meant, that we just couldn't continue to meet because of the social distancing and how many people would be allowed to meet together. The next day, the President's task force reduced that further, and then he added another executive order that followed in line with that. And so that's what we've been following. His next significant executive order that affected us more directly was on April 6th. And these are, if you haven't read these through, they are full of legalese. I mean, the whereases can go on page after page after page. Well, we've read through all of that, and we have looked for things that directly affect us. And that one on April 6th had several statements where we are very directly included. And that is, for the first time, he identified churches as providing an essential service. That was welcome news. And he had several others that fit into that category as well. And then at the end of that section, for all of those that, in that sense, get some exceptions to the social distancing and stay at home order and so forth, that they said, now within those exceptions, you still have to stay 6 feet apart from everybody else. So it's not as if even in that statement that he said, well, churches can do what they want. Churches could still meet, but you have to be able to enforce the 6-foot social distancing standard. So that's why we've continued to not meet, because we don't have a facility that is large enough for our church family to meet there. In fact, we've calculated we'd have to have at least 4 and probably 5 identical services to make sure that we could offer a service for everybody who would want to come. And that would be so cumbersome that it just seems it's beyond reasonable and beyond practical. If we could get that down to 3 services, if they would reduce the requirements so that we could fit enough people in that everybody could come in 3 services, we'll do that in a minute. If he makes that announcement on a Friday afternoon or even on a Saturday, we are ready to put that into action, and we'll go ahead and have those 3 services. But the way things are right now, it's still the 6 feet, and you realize that you can't have a nursery with social distancing. You cannot change a diaper from 6 feet away. Although perhaps this would provide enough incentive for somebody to invent a way to do that, because there'd be some other advantages to that social distancing. But so far, you can't do that. You can't care for children, and you can't keep really young children away from each other in a nursery or even a Sunday school classroom. You know, the classrooms that we have upstairs, they're not very large. They would be closer than the 6 feet. Can't have children's church for that basis either. So that's where we are right now. It's just not practical for us to do that. As soon as we get a green light from the governor, we're ready to move forward and let us all come back again. One other thing, I want you to know that we haven't entered this whole process feeling at all like we know exactly what's going on, what's coming up, and what we're doing. It's waiting for the next announcement, trying to understand that, trying to digest all of the whereases and so forth. And that's taken some time. There are several things that have contributed, though, to help give us a greater sense of clarity now than we had even 8 or 10 days ago. And that is that I was able to participate in a Zoom meeting with other area pastors that I mentioned on Sunday, and that was extremely helpful in the sense that it enabled us to realize that they're all grappling with the same thing, and every one of them were coming to the same conclusion. You just can't meet right now. Well, there was one exception, and that was one church that has a facility that is about 4 times larger than their current attendance. So they can socially distance because of their size of their congregation. You know, that doesn't work in our situation because our auditorium is quite full, as well as every other aspect of our building. We also had a Zoom meeting with all of our deacons the next day after that pastor's meeting. That was really helpful, and sharing ideas and perplexities, and some could lend clarity in that circumstance. That was really helpful. Then we talked about it together further, and all of this has helped bring us to the point where we feel like we really do understand what the governor is saying now. We really can't meet yet, and we are just waiting for that next step where it's relaxed enough that we can do multiple services in a practical way and accommodate everybody in our church family.
We've even seen how some churches have used an outdoor option for gatherings and so forth. And again, we feel like, based on pretty extensive discussion on the options that we would have, when you include things like audiovisual in a situation like that, space to do that, while also having space for vehicles and things like that. We've come to the conclusion on that one as well that as of right now, with the current restrictions, that is also pretty impractical for us. We wish we could do something like that, but again, because of the limitations, naturally, that to the facility and the property that God has given us, that we are, Lord willing, in the process of improving, as you know, that would present probably too big of a challenge as well. But we have had those discussions too.
Mm-hmm.
Hebrews 10 is a passage that is being discussed quite a bit among God's people, and rightfully so. That's the passage where the author of Hebrews expresses very clearly that we are not to forsake the assembling of ourselves together, but to urgently pursue that opportunity and to continue with that urgency as we await Christ's return. So we thought it might be good to briefly reference that passage in our and the way that we feel we can continue to obey that passage, even with the restrictions currently in place.
Yes, it's important to realize that when the author wrote those words, nobody met in church buildings. They only had homes available to them. So assembling of yourselves together, even in the first century, when their sense was all of these homes, all these people belonged to one church, but the whole church couldn't meet together. And from that standpoint, they were obeying Hebrews 10, 24, and 25. So it isn't a biblical command that you have to all gather together in one place. That's our preference. That's what we want to do. But we are not disobeying it by each of us being in homes and at least sharing. We are using the technology that's available. We also are aware that there are some in our church family that are inviting others to join them in their home to watch the live stream, or in some cases to watch a recording later. And we have no quarrel with that. Not everybody's going to be comfortable with that, but those that are, that seems to be a reasonable option of sharing and assembling together. But understanding what that passage actually means, we are confident that we are not forsaking. We are striving by God's grace to balance several biblical principles, and one of those very important ones is to obey what the government says. As Brian said earlier, they are not targeting churches. This is not persecution. They have a responsibility for the health of our citizens, as we do as well. So we are thankful for what opportunities we do have to communicate and share and share together.
And yet we know how important for all of us the assembling all together is. And that is where we can turn our attention to now. And discussing, okay, that's where we have been and where we are now, but where do we go from here? That's the next thing we want to share with you, because we do have, there are still a lot of dark corners in that perspective. Mm-hmm. But there are some things that we can share and that we want to share and that we are excited to share with you. And I think that when you look at what the combination of the task force, the federal task force, and how that has been passed on to the governor, the communication that they have used in terms, the national task force, the federal task force has used the terminology of different levels of social distancing to describe how things could open back up again. And there have been some variations on this, but mostly we could categorize them as strict social distancing, that's phase 1, moderate, which would be phase 2, and then more of a relaxed, I think is the term that we have heard most, and that would be phase 3. And of course, phase 4 is all systems go as normal, which is what we are praying for ultimately, for sure. And the government, the federal government, has then passed that on to the governors, and we have not heard our governor reference those specifically up to this point that we know of. He appears to have entered some aspects of phase one with the lifting of certain orders this past week on Monday. And so we are sensing that that's where we are right now from him in phase one, more or less.
Even though we don't quite qualify for the President's Commission on describing phase one, but it seems like that's, he's got the right to define it how he wants to.
Sure. The President has given him that authority. So for our perspective, this is how we perceive this potentially going. And we could define it as whenever there is a green light into that moderate social distancing category. We're not sure what that green light would look like, but when there is one, we will move. We will act. We will, as soon as we receive that, we are going to pursue that, as Pastor said already earlier. But we're not sure what form that takes yet, because we have not had moderate social distancing defined for us specifically yet. A couple of examples of what it may look like. It may look like the distance that defines social distancing shrinking, perhaps. And these are just guesses. Maybe, for example, from 6 feet to 3 feet. Well, then we can double our occupancy in the building at that point, and then we can meet. Another example would be, like Pastor mentioned earlier, multiple identical services. We would aim for 3, because anything beyond that is going to be a significant logistical and practical challenge for us.
Our whole building, I mean, every place that we use in the building has to be re-sanitized after every service. So you get beyond 3 and the practicality of it really diminishes. 3 sounds good to us. We'll do that.
Well, 7 sounds good to us if we could pull it off. We really do feel that way. But 3 seems the practical level that we can aim for. And so when we receive opportunity, perhaps in communication of a limited number, where we're given the number of 150, perhaps, or something similar to that, well, then it's all systems go at that point, even if it's a last-minute opportunity. And then, so that really is where we are with this right now. We need some help from our governor to define exactly what this looks like. But once he does, we are ready to go. And we will have plans in place. It will look quite different in all likelihood. There will be social distancing indicators, perhaps, around the building for us to follow. Our child care may look quite different. And we have several different ideas bantering about on what that could look like. But the fact of the matter is, it will still be very special to be together. And that is our goal, and that's what we're looking for from our governor at this point.
Now, you may hear of other churches in the area, in South Carolina, even in Greenville, that are starting to reopen, and you might think, well, why can they do it and we can't? Keep in mind, there may be differing facility options that they might have. There might be differing perspectives on our situation. It could be that some churches will decide, well, let's just go ahead and do it. Probably in South Carolina, they're not going to come after us. And that's probably right. But our perspective is we have to guard our conscience and not get away with what we can. We have to limit ourselves to doing what we are convinced is right. And we know you understand that too, and share those convictions. And we just wanted to assure you tonight that we are striving to do our best to lead our church family through this difficult time. Any suggestions you have for us to consider, we'd sure love to hear from you, as we are open to those suggestions.